Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. We are just coming to you live. It is Thursday, September 10th, 7:02 p.m. This is, let's see, Town Hall number 743. This is Religious Scrupulosity, Volume 2. And as always, we like to have you come in, say hello, let us know where you're from, give a couple minutes for everyone to get in and loaded. So please say hello. Let us know your name, where you're coming from, how you're doing, and then we'll get started in the next 90 seconds. Hi, Fabrice. I hope you're well. This is where I pretend I'm doing really important things. Oh, Point Siena, Florida. Very cool. Hi, Yvonne. Hope you're well. We'll get everybody, oh, hi, OCD Interrupted. We'll get everybody loading in. Hey, Taylor in Atlanta. I'm in Atlanta too. Amber in California. I'm not saying Guerneville. Janine in Hampton. As everybody gets loaded in, I want to thank you for spending your Thursday evening with us. This is the Religious Scrupulosity Town Hall Volume 2. Hey, Denise in Gloucester. We have an awesome panel for you. We're going to start in 15 seconds. Tommy in Dublin, Ireland. Oh, maybe Nikki will come in. Nikki's in Dublin as well. Maybe you know her. I hate when people say that, you know, like you're in a completely different country. You're like, oh, you're from America. Do you know Joe? I'm like, no, I don't know Joe in America. But maybe you do know Nikki. I don't know. We'll see. James from New York State. Very cool. All right. We are just a couple minutes past, or at least 4 minutes past the hour, but 2 minutes into the live stream. So let's get started. My name is Ethan. I'm the National Ambassador for the International OCD Foundation, which, as you know, means I just like to talk about OCD all the time, over and over and over again, so we can all continue to educate and reduce stigma. Let me just get through some housekeeping so we can get right into business. So this town hall is intended to serve as educational content and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please be sure to work with your local provider or contact a local clinician. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline and should not be used if you are in distress or feel unsafe. If you're in a crisis or you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911, or call the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 800-273-8255. And also, September is National Suicide Prevention Month. So there's a lot of good facts and stuff on the website. Be sure to check it out. As always, we want to be kind and respectful toward others. Always, 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 but especially in conversations like this where we're touching on very sensitive content. So understand that we try to do as good of a job as possible of keeping a safe and respectful space, but this is also still online that will be on the interwebs for all the world to see for eternity. So, which is a long time. And we'll probably talk about eternity at some point during this conversation. So, so again, you can be honest, be safe. We booted people when we've had to, so we'll take care of business, but be respectful and kind. It always turns into great advocacy. And with that, let's get to our panelists. So for Jed, Tawana, Katie, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Glad to be.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. So I'm gonna read a little bit about each of our panelists, everyone, and then we'll get rolling. And also, of course, as always, we'll talk for about a half hour, and then we'll get into Q&A. So so yes, as you're already asking questions, so please load in questions.
It looks like Tommy does know her. Tommy does know her.
Tommy knows her. Where?
In Ireland.
Oh, you do know Nikki. Okay. They know us through there, though. Not like, did you know her just because you were in Ireland or because you connected? That's awesome. I love that. Thank you, Katie. So let's start with Tawana. So Tawana lives in Cleveland, Ohio. She's diagnosed with OCD and PTSD. She's the founder of My Sister's Keeper of Northeast Ohio, a 501c4 organization that works toward educating and lobbying on the issues of minority mental health to the state legislature and helping minority women and minority children and teens get the resources they need to improve their mental health, which is beyond needed. She's a lobbyist in the state of Ohio for minority mental health and women issues. She's a certified peer support specialist with the state of Ohio and runs a virtual support group for individuals suffering from OCD and PTSD. I like how Tawana just nodded. I was like, did you not know you were doing that? No. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. She hosts a podcast called My Sister's Keeper that talks about minority mental health as it affects African-American women. As a writer, she self-published her mental health struggles in a poetic memorial and working on a trilogy series in the fiction arena. By day, she's an accountant for a Fortune 500 company. By night, an MFA-seeking student at Cleveland State University. So what we've learned is she has a lot of free time on her hands. I also want to read something that she wrote, and I'll read it from her point of view because I love this perspective. She says, I am married to David, my high school sweetheart, with 7 children and 7 grandchildren. My father is a pastor, a Baptist pastor from down south, and does not believe in mental health. Therefore, in my family, I'm the black sheep, even though mental health issues run rampant in my family and children. It is my goal to put a minority face on mental health to break stigma and barriers that minorities face. I also want to speak my truth about my journey with my own mental health, and at the beginning of this journey, how I was misdiagnosed and shamed by my father's congregation. So really powerful stuff. We'll get into it, but thank you so much, Tawana, for being here again.
No problem.
Next, we have Reverend Katie O'Dunn. She is new to the panel. Katie, known to her students as Chaplain K, is passionate about promoting peace, understanding, and compassion. She graduated from Candler School of Theology at Emory with her Master of Divinity in May 2015 and a Certificate of Religion and Health. While she is proud to serve as an ordained minister in the Southeast Conference of the United Church of Christ, interfaith work is her true passion. Katie has spent the last 5 years serving as the Academy Chaplain at the Pauline and R.L. Brand Jr. Chair of Religious Studies at Woodward Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. There she seeks to inspire students of various faiths to develop a sense of empathy through respectful ecumenical dialogue. Katie teaches religious literacy to over 150 students per year, offers pastoral care to 2,700 families of diverse faith traditions in times of crisis, and has worked to develop a compassion capstone curriculum for independent schools. She's currently pursuing additional coursework to focus on the intersection between spiritual and mental health. And she wants everyone, especially her students, to know that religious leaders, counselors, teachers also struggle with mental illness too. And therefore, there's no shame in getting help. Katie has been inspired by her own lifelong battle with OCD, as well as her experience helping her students nervously seek to explain their diagnosed mental health concerns to religious practitioners in various houses of worship. She hopes to develop programs to encourage a deeper understanding of mental illness within diverse religious communities, while fostering positive, collaborative relationships between religious practitioners and mental health providers. Thank you, Katie. Katie obviously has a lot of free time as well. Last but certainly not least, we have Jed Siev. Jed is assistant professor of psychology at Swarthmore College and a licensed clinical psychologist. Previously, he directed the Anxiety Treatment Center and founded the OCD and Related Disorders program at Nova Southeastern University after completing training at the Massachusetts General Hospital and the University of Pennsylvania. Jed's research focuses on information processing, judgment and decision-making, and metacognitive processing involved in the maintenance and reduction of OCD, hoarding, and anxiety. He has a particular interest in unacceptable thoughts and especially scrupulosity. He is currently writing a book for Oxford University Press on how to treat scrupulosity. Jed, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so needless to say, from what you all gathered, we have a wonderfully diverse and smart, brilliant panel. So I'm excited to get into to stuff. So before we get started, I would like to simply define religious scrupulosity from both a clinical perspective and a personal perspective. So Tawana, let's start with you. How would you define religious scrupulosity for yourself?
Well, when I was actually going through everything, I would have to pray a certain prayer in the morning in a certain order, or I would have a messed up day. I would have to pray a certain prayer at night in a certain order, or I was not going to wake up. I had to go to church. I had to go to church because if I didn't go to church, God would be angry and he would destroy my life somehow. So, 3 days a week, sometimes in my father's congregation, it's more than that. I was in church more than I was at home because I thought God was going to be upset. So I think it's an over obsession with God and all kinds in that. That's the only way I can say it, because I don't know how to clinically say it. It's just like being really, really overly obsessed with doing right, being right, living right, acting right, talking right, speaking right, or you're going to hell or you're going to die. That's how I viewed it.
Jed, what is the clinical definition of religious scrupulosity?
Well, you know, with OCD, with all kinds of OCD, there are like infinite different sort of variations on the obsessional themes everybody has. I like to think about scrupulosity less as being a subtype. People like to use that word, and really being more like a category of core fear. And so what I mean by that is it can sort of be manifest in really any other symptom dimension. You can have people who you would say are scrupulous, but their symptoms sort of, I don't know, topographically maybe, are really contamination symptoms. It's just about ritual purity. Several religions have lots of ritual purity laws and customs and rituals. It can be sexual kinds of obsessions, but a core fear may be that it's sinful or blasphemous or something like that. So it can really take on just about any form that we see with all sorts of OCD. But if the core fear has something to do with morality, with religion, we're talking about religious scrupulosity today, then I think of it as scrupulous. And I acknowledge that the boundary gets a little bit messy because there are things we don't think of as scrupulous, even though pretty much everybody agrees they would be immoral. So for me, it really has to do with the individual who has OCD. Is their fear focused on the I'd be bad, evil, immoral, sinful, those kinds of things? And if it is, then no matter what the specifics are, I'd think of that as scrupulous. And if it's not, then not.
Katie, from a professional perspective, have you had to deal with religious scrupulosity in your own work?
Yeah, so it's interesting quite often, but often in ways where I recognize things as OCD because of a lifelong battle with OCD, but not because of a particular diagnosis with my students. And gosh, over the last 5 years, I've seen a number of students, particularly in devout religious traditions, and that is sometimes in Christianity, but I've also seen that with my Hindu students, my Muslim students, my Sikh students, and my Jewish students, in ways that they become obsessed with doing their rituals correctly in order to please God. And the really interesting thing with this, I mean, it's taken on forms where I think for me, where it becomes an issue and kind of goes into the realm of religious scrupulosity is when it crosses from my students that want to pray 5 times a day because that's what they want to do as a part of their faith tradition, to the I have to do this because I'm trying to alleviate this obsession I have that something absolutely horrible is going to happen and God is going to punish me and God will be angry with me. And it's really interesting just getting to know OCD, how much of this I actually see that's not diagnosed.
Absolutely. Tawana, did you have thoughts? You were shaking your head.
Well, I have a book by Joyce Myers. It's right here on the floor and I'm looking at it. But in the book, it says if you speak the scriptures out loud, certain scriptures out loud, it changes your atmosphere and stuff. If I could show you this book, you will see how often I use this wait, let me get it. Sorry. It's like, you see how often when I was going through it, how it's like completely raggedy because I was like this every day. I had to carry this in my purse and I had to say certain scriptures and do it a certain way or my whole day would be messed up. And I mean, I actually believe that. And when I didn't do it, I tell you my day was not right. I mean, I know that it's a mental thing now, but I was like, because I didn't pray this prayer, that means I'm not going to get blessed today. And my day was like completely messed up that day. And it was like horrible.
And that's, obviously we see that in a number of manifestations, as Jed said, of OCD. And please load the comment thread with questions. We will be getting to them in probably the next 15 minutes. But Jed, I never want to intimate at all that one subtype or manifestation of OCD is more sinister than the next. They're all horrendous and equally painful, no matter whether it's pedophilia or sexual intrusive thoughts or contamination or having to rewrite words or reread words. It's all awful. What is it about religious scrupulosity that really muddies the water? Because some of the genesis of the the compulsions are rooted in text and faith and grounded in ritual and traditions and lifestyle. So, you know, it's very difficult to tweeze out that place of where the boundary crosses between, you know, appropriate religious practice and OCD. Is that where it starts to muddy?
Yeah, that's a big challenge, no question, for both clinicians and for folks who are struggling with it themselves, just like disentangling the religion from the OCD. How can you tell? If you're not real familiar with certain practices, it'd be very hard from the outside to tell whether something sounds like an OCD ritual or a religious ritual. Even that word ritual, it's a funny word because we use it as synonymous with compulsions in the OCD world. But a ritual, if you step into a religious institution, means something very different. But Ethan, I think you were also hinting at the fact that, you know, there are certainly harder things sort of about every OCD manifestation. There are special challenges. And one of the ones that's like that for scrupulosity, especially religious scrupulosity, is it feels like something different is on the line. Like even if you think your life or even somebody else's life is on the line, as many people with OCD do with other manifestations, this is like cosmic, you know, like eternity is on the line. And when you have people, you know, obsessing about the unpardonable sin, I mean, there's no turning back. The word is unpardonable. And so the stakes seem so high that it can be harder for people to make judgments like, well, other people seem to be okay with this level of risk. It's acceptable in our society to, you know, not check every time when you're driving and you think you might have bumped over something. But people often really struggle to understand, like, but how can I take a risk if God says do this or don't do that? Who am I to even judge that I have any leeway there? And so similarly, it's really closely entwined with people's just personal values, even aside from the God part. But you know, it latches onto somebody's values, and so there's like a sense of self that's threatened more with scrupulosity, and maybe a couple of other similar unacceptable thoughts. Forms where it's like, this isn't me. Who am I? What am I capable of? That has a little bit of a different flavor sometimes.
That makes. Go ahead,
sorry.
No. Go ahead.
With me, my father's a pastor, and I grew up in a Christian home, so that was like a double whammy. Because from one end, when I told him that when I tried to explain things to him, he told me that I must have did something to God to make God mad. So I had that whammy, and then the thought, oh, well, maybe I did. And what am I not doing to make things right? You know, so for me, it was hard. I had to internalize a lot, which made things 10 times worse. But I mean, it's really, really hard to be that close to it and then go through it with no support.
Yeah, can I just say one thing that Tawana reminded me of also? Another thing that I see often is with other co-religionists, I guess, you know, people in your congregation or your community, yeah. They can sometimes, even if the person is not a clergy member and is not a family member, they can sometimes inadvertently reinforce scroop stuff a little bit more than we see with other areas. If somebody is washing their hands, you know, 40 times in an hour, most people aren't going to be like, oh, that's so great, you're so clean. But when somebody is so very careful and meticulous and pious, I'm Jewish, and I grew up going to Orthodox Jewish schools, and I can tell you the word scrupulous is often used as a compliment, right? A rabbi will be up there speaking about how scrupulous somebody is in their business dealings, by which the rabbi is trying to say, they're meticulous, they're careful, they go out of their way to make sure that they never touch anybody's money that they shouldn't be touching, that kind of stuff. But that's so funny to me, of course, in this world. But it reminds me a little bit of what happens sometimes with body image, where in our culture, for better or for worse, it's okay if you didn't see somebody for a while to say, hey, you look great, did you lose weight? And that's sort of fine, unless it turns out that they have cancer, or if it turns out that they have anorexia. And for a while, before people realize how bad the anorexia is, somebody might be getting a lot of compliments about their weight loss. And so it can be like that as well in the religious world, where somebody can be so scrupulous, and other people for a while think that's really like holy of them, so to speak.
So
Janet, oh, sorry.
No, I was gonna actually tee off something for you, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I agree. I think that happens so often in worship contexts, even if it's not overt or directed at a particular person, with religious practitioners that don't know that they're causing any harm, even standing up in the pulpit or leading whatever religious tradition they're a part of, and leading a confession of sin, which seems like such a minor thing, that can just be so incredibly triggering for individuals on a regular basis. And I'll talk throughout this about this, but I have battled all sorts of OCD, harm OCD, POCD, all sorts of different things. And even in times before ordination, I remember sitting in church and having a prayer of confession come up and just having so much shame just because we're being told to confess all of our sins, right? And it's all of those things, I think, as they emerge, even within the liturgy, can be really, really triggering, even if it's not meant to be.
So, Katie, I have two questions for you. One is mental illness, OCD, but mental illness, viewed in, and I don't want to generalize and say all religions, but within different sects of religions, is it stigmatized the same as same sex or gender issue, not gender, gender or sexuality? Is it viewed in that same, if it goes again? Yeah, go ahead. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're trying to say.
You can answer.
So what I generally tell my students, I think within every religious tradition, there's kind of a spectrum, and you have more conservative sects and you tend to have more progressive sects. And I usually tell my students that's based on how each tradition tends to read scripture. So you have groups that read whatever their religious scripture is, whether that's the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita, whatever that looks like. There are some that read it as inerrant, which means they see it as this absolute perfect word of God. And there are others that see it as non-inerrant. And that tends to be the more progressive groups that see it as open to interpretation, open to change. And what generally happens in the groups who see it as the absolute perfect word of God, sometimes you get a more conservative perspective on LGBT issues, on mental illness, on lots of different things. And then you tend to have more progressive sects in each tradition that are much more open to female ordination, to LGBTQ ordination or marriage, as well as ideas around mental illness. And I always tell my students, I don't think it's that one particular group over another is trying to be stigmatizing or mean, but I think it's just this, in sometimes this lack of awareness of how that connects with our society. And I think every tradition that takes place, as Tawana's talked about with her dad's church, there's definitely that lens where there is a lot of shame around that. And then there are much more progressive churches that are leading, mental health courses in the pews. And you see the same thing in the Jewish tradition. In the Muslim tradition, I've worked with families that completely deny mental illness exists. And then I've worked with other Muslim families in different mosques that, again, are holding mental health trainings in their spaces. So I think it really depends, and there's a spectrum, which is what makes it so challenging to think about how we can start having these conversations with practitioners.
So the disconnect is the translation of whatever the religious text is. Mm-hmm. And what you think, Jed? Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, all of that. I agree with all of that, and I want to throw like a tiny wrench into it, a drop, which is just that, for example, we have some data showing that Orthodox Jews who tend to take the more I forgot the word you used, Reverend Katie, but a more
inerrant
sort of approach. Actually, we're better at recognizing scrupulosity. We gave some vignettes with like contamination OCD and then more scrupulous versions than were more liberal or more secular Jewish denominations. And so those things are true. And at the same time, sometimes familiarity, especially with a religion like Judaism, Islam would probably be kind of similar, with so many specific little rules and regulations, really make it easier at times to be able to figure out when somebody is going overboard. Like you can benchmark better against what's typical in the community and that sort of thing. I don't know if that applies quite as well to Protestant denominations when there isn't as much like behavioral detail like that. But it can sometimes be the case that the more strict denominations or rabbis, clergy members in those areas are particularly good at noticing when something's going wrong over here.
I think it has to do with culture too, because in my culture, African American culture, church is everything. And then, I mean, they really don't believe in mental health or nothing. That's a sign of weakness. So putting that in the mix with somebody that has OCD and a father who's a pastor, it's just really tough to actually talk about it. Because I mean, until I started speaking out about it, we never talked about it in my family. And now that I talk about it, I'm embarrassing them. I'm looking for attention. And my brother said today, actually, he said today that I'm a attention seeker and some other stuff. And I was like, oh, wow, really? Because I would have never wanted to get attention from having this. It's torturous to me when I was actually having the symptoms like every single day. And don't get me wrong, my brother has issues too with OCD. He doesn't admit to it. And it's just our culture makes it so hard to, because it was when I got misdiagnosed 17 years ago, everybody around me was like, you need to go to church, you need Jesus. And I did that. They did not think about therapy or anything like that. And if I bring this up to my father's congregation, I'll get blackballed again. So it's like, it's really tough for my culture.
Katie.
Yeah, and I think going off of what Jed and Tawana were both saying, I actually love hearing that in I don't know, in particular traditions, that ritual becomes so significant that it might be easier to pick out when there's an even greater extreme. And I can definitely see that taking place. I think the only issue that I still tend to see with practitioners in those areas, I've seen some that do notice that one of my students is doing something that's to an extreme, but their solution still becomes rooted in the faith itself, which makes it more problematic. So for instance, I've seen a student that took their Muslim faith to a very far extreme, but then they were given books on how to purify their heart so that they could stop taking it to that extreme. So it becomes this cycle. And that reminds me, Tawana, of what you're saying, when even if something is recognized, or even when you come forward, I think if individuals aren't knowledgeable on exactly what's going on, or feel comfortable connecting with mental health practitioners, then there's an even greater shame around, well, we can just pray this away, or we can do this in a spiritual way, when sometimes there's something different that needs to happen.
Or read the Psalms. I've been told to read the Psalms a lot.
And just Tawana, as always, and Nico just wrote, Tawana, so good that you're doing this despite your family's reaction. So very, very admirable, so hard to do, but so important. Betsy wrote, Tawana, you're an inspiration. So as always, thank you. I'm going to just hit a few more questions because this is really important, and then we'll definitely go into to you guys' questions. So Katie, I'm wondering have you found well, first of all, actually, I want to speak to Tawana's conversation about just not religious, but cultural. Do you have thoughts about that specifically in relation to, and we've had diversity panels, we've talked about the cultural stigma in the Black community, on top of, everything else, on top of faith. How does that all tie in your mind? Where's that come from?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is from the experiences of my students and not my personal experience. So I acknowledge that that these are things maybe that I haven't experienced, but working with a number of my Black students, particularly in church communities, unfortunately, regardless of mental illness, have experienced similar things that Tawana has discussed. And I think there are some cultural components there, but I also see a lot of those cultural components in the Indian community. And I actually work at school right now with kind of a South Asian affinity group. And I was meeting with those kids earlier today, and they were raising this exact same idea around mental health and mental illness, and being really afraid to come and talk to their parents about it, not just as a part of Hinduism or as a part of Islam, but just as a part of what it means to be a good son or daughter in the Indian culture, and have it together and want to look perfect. So I think there are some cultural components there, and there's this idea that you have to have it together all the time. And I think that's in religion, but especially sometimes in our cultural minorities.
Tawana or Jed, do you have anything to add?
I think like what Katie said, my culture is always, we have to be strong. We have to be strong regardless of what, especially now, if you look at what's going on in the world with all this racial tension, we cannot do anything that show weakness. And mental illness is a weakness, unfortunately. And I think like when I try to talk to my father, because he has high blood pressure, I was like, well, if you think about it, high blood pressure is a weakness. And he's like, well, that's different. How's it different? And that's what I don't understand. But, you know, we were raised, and my grandmother was the same way, and she was a hoarder like my mom, but they didn't want to admit it. And we were raised not to talk about it. So we don't talk about it. Well, I do, but we didn't talk about it. And we went to church and we prayed and we sung the hymns and all that other stuff that they did way back when. And that was supposed to make things better, and it doesn't.
Two more questions, then we'll get right in. Thank you, Tawana. Two more questions, then we'll get right into viewer questions. Jed, I'm curious, and you may not, I don't know the research that you've done. Are you seeing a correlation between like the gross stigmatization in other faiths based on geography? For instance, you know, is mental health so stigmatized in Hindu and Islam and some of those other religious faiths because of geography, whether the third world countries, impoverished nations, marginalized communities? Does that have a lot to do with the increased belief to push it away?
I don't have any good data to speak to that directly. So the most honest answer is I don't know. But I will say that a lot of if we're talking about like rates and severity and that sort of thing of OCD, we don't see huge differences across cultures, with a couple of notable exceptions. You know, OCD is manifest for a lot of people in a lot of places. Of course, the way it's manifest depends a lot on what's important to you and what you know about. So we all know so many folks with OCD nowadays have obsessions if they have contamination kind of symptoms that have to do with HIV and AIDS and hepatitis and those kinds of things. You know, in 1950, people still had OCD, but they weren't worried about AIDS because nobody knew about it then. And so clearly, whatever is sort of salient to you and concerning your OCD will latch onto it. And that's why if you look in countries, speaking of regions and geography, you look at countries like in the Middle East, among people who have OCD, huge proportions of them have either scrupulosity or at least some scrupulous symptoms as well. And the numbers are much lower in America because just of the values and the culture and that sort of thing. But that's about as far as I can answer that question. And the rest, I'm not sure.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I'm talking to a woman right now in Jordan who said she can't seek help because she's a woman, you know, and she needs to get to the States. And then I'll never forget, I got an email maybe 4 years ago from a woman in Africa, a small city in Nigeria. And she emailed me, and it was very difficult to decipher the email, but basically asking for help. And she was asking for help because she has these thoughts and she doesn't know what to do with them. And they're very violent and compulsive and they race. And she went to her village doctor and told the village doctor about the thoughts. And the village doctor told her, because I've known you for so long, I'm not going to say anything that you told me this, but if you bring it up again, we'll burn you for being a witch. And I was like, that exists? Like, I mean, like, I felt so ignorant. The fact that that level of stigma still exists. Like, you're not just weak, you're a witch, and we're going to burn you for talking about. So it really like opened my eyes to like, wow, there's I have no clue what's going on. You know, sitting here as a white male in America, I have no clue what's going on. Go ahead, Tawana.
In 2017, when I went back to get help, I presented this to my father's congregation. They told me I was possessed with the devil. So I can relate to that.
Tawana, I was just going to say, I've had students here in Atlanta diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder that have had exorcisms completed on them by religious communities. So, yeah.
I could piggyback on and just say that I had a colleague who had somebody come from another country for OCD treatment with him. And the OCD overlapped with a lot of sexuality kind of themes. And my colleague was working with this person, and another colleague sort of said to my colleague, look, just be careful what you encourage him to do when he goes back home, because he could actually be executed if he's open about that.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So the last question before we get into viewer questions, I want to pose to Katie, which is, and this is something that you and I were talking about after the first religious scrupulosity, which is, how do you, in your opinion, intersect and approach, and somebody may have asked this question, this issue of, I want my faith to support me, that faith and mental health don't have to contradict, right? The exact situation that Tawana is in. In your opinion, one, you said they don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can both exist. So speak to that a little bit, and then maybe your thoughts on how to even broach the subject.
Yeah, well, I'll say watching the last town hall, my heart was kind of wrenched for you, Tawana. It really was, because it just, as someone who works in religion, I am also the biggest critic of religion. And it absolutely destroys me, the way what's happened to you and what's happened to so many people. And yeah, so all of my education is in faith and health, and I don't think those two things have to be mutually exclusive. I actually think that there's a place for healthy spirituality, and that the reason, as Jed said before, that for so many people, OCD latches onto their faith is because faith is important. And I think that it's a real shame when, because of that thing that was so important to you to begin with can't be a part of your life, because you feel like it has to be separate because of the thoughts and because of this, that, and the other. And I think those two things can come together, where I think there are opportunities for religious practitioners to have conversations with mental health practitioners where, yeah, prayer and spirituality can be a part of your life, but legitimate evidence-based treatment can be a part too. And I think there's an opportunity for conversations around that. So I'm doing some research on that now and how we can put programs together. But I think just from the OCD perspective, there's also a different way to think about faith. I think sometimes we think about faith with OCD and religious scrupulosity as this big scary thing. We hear faith and it's like, oh my gosh, I have faith in a God who is going to make sure something horrible happens to me if I don't do this ritual or if I'm a bad person. And I think sometimes there's also a space for faith in our treatment, and to be able to say, you know what, I have faith that this thing is really, really scary. But if I continue to move through this my scripting, my ERP, I have faith that it'll be okay. And I have faith that God can walk with me through that. And I think there's a way to frame things a little bit differently in your mind, that it doesn't have to be this big, scary thing. You can also have faith about the treatment itself, and know that with your faith, that God created these awesome practitioners who put this treatment into place, and that you can do that and still have your faith.
I had that argument with my father, because I told him God made therapists, and he was like, yeah, but which God? So that's kind of shaky. My whole thing with religion right now is, yeah, I got a lot of questions for Jesus or whoever but it's basically because of the backlash I got from the people that follow him. How can you claim love and treat somebody like that? Is beyond me. And you claim his name, and he allows you to claim his name. So I'm at a crossroads right now. As far as religion, I tend to stay away from it right now, because it hurt. I mean, I go to my father's church to support him when he preaches, but we all do. And other than that, I try to get out of there as quickly as possible. I do my own meditation, and I really don't look at the Bible all like I used to, because it brings back pain for me.
Yeah, if I can just add on one thought there.
Of course, Chad.
A lot of people who are getting treatment for groups feel trapped between choosing their faith and choosing their mental health, and that's unfortunate that somebody should have to be put in a position. It's unfortunate for a lot of reasons, obviously, and of course, Tawana has talked about a really difficult situation where it's not just that the symptoms were about religion and faith for her, but also she was really mistreated by other people within the congregation, and so that's I don't mean to touch on that piece of it. Most people say, we used to say this, to patients, and we decided to actually collect the data to see if we were telling them the truth. And by landslide, we were. Most people with scrupulosity, with religious scrupulosity, say that their symptoms interfere with their relationship with God and with their religious observance. It's not facilitating it. Of course, it feels like an effort to facilitate it. I got to be so careful. I got to repeat the prayer just right. I got to do these things in order to do it right. But the consequence is that it ends up serving as a barrier. And OCD becomes so entangled, like we've been talking about with religion, it's hard to even sort them apart. And religion starts to feel oppressive and those sorts of things. And so there's certainly people who choose to walk away from religion, and people choose that for all sorts of reasons, and that's fine. But for people who don't want to do that and do feel trapped, but want their mental health, but also value their religion, I think that treatment is really, can be framed in service of that. Like, let's cut out the OCD that is making this religion, it's wrecking it for you. It's ruining your relationship with God. It's making this all feel, I don't know what words to use other than oppressive, miserable, you're afraid all the time, that kind of stuff. Let's cut that out so you can stop worshiping your OCD in a sense by deciding what you can do and can't do and have to do all the time in order to feel better. And let's cut that out so you can actually have a better religious experience if that's what you want.
Yeah, Jed, I have a sticky right here that I look at for myself that says I'm willing to risk being everything I'm afraid of for the chance at the life I want. And I think for people that the life that they want includes their faith, that's one of the carrots right there.
Exactly. Yep.
Beautifully said. And I love the grand paradox is the grand paradox of this whole thing is faith. The faith is the most important thing in religion, and it's the most important thing in doing ERP and therapy, because you got to it's that radical faith, it's that leap of faith. It's just faith all around. So intrinsically, it's all faith, which is very interesting. And at the same time, it's the dividing factor. So, all right, let's jump into some questions. Unless, Tawana, did you have something to add?
Well, not at this point.
Okay, no worries.
Comments.
No, always feel free to weigh in for sure. So at 7:06 p.m., Carlos asks, how would you differentiate OCD from OCPD when it comes to religious scrupulosity? Jed, I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, the first thing that comes straight to mind about that, it has to do with what's driving it, what's driving the behavior, and maybe the beliefs as well. So OCD and scrupulosity, no different from any other type, is almost always driven by anxiety or fear. Maybe sometimes we see other emotions like disgust play a role, but usually we're talking about anxiety and fear. And OCPD doesn't really have that intrusive nature. It's not really driven by anxiety and fear. And it's tends, what goes along with that, it tends to be less ego dystonic in terms of the content. And so it's more like principled beliefs. Now, people with OCPD may have awareness or may not about the impact the OCPD is having on their relationships, let's say, on their life in other ways. But often their instinct is to be like, well, but this is the right way to do it. Like, more people should be doing it like this. I don't hear that from folks who have scrupulosity, who are twisted and contorted with all of the suffering and anxiety and fear about it. They're not saying everybody else should be doing this too. They wish they could stop. So I think that's probably the most striking thing that's clearly different between the two. That said, we actually have a paper just in press now that found that people with scrup have higher rates of OCPD than people with contamination OCD. So those two things can co-occur and maybe do co-occur at higher rates, which is, of course, just an extra challenge. So it's not to say one would only struggle with one and not the other. You could be struggling with both.
Thank you. And just to clarify, if for those that don't know, OCPD is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, for the differentiation between the two. I'll also quickly throw this question to you, Jed. Caroline asks, although of course Katie or Tawana, feel free to weigh in. Is it possible for some to have 7:14 p.m. Fran? Sorry. Is it possible for some to have scrupulosity but not have OCD?
That's probably like a semantic definitional kind of thing. I don't think so. There was a paper that was published maybe in 2008 or so that tried to make the argument that scrupulosity should be thought of as its own disorder. And I think that the OCD community kind of rebutted that, and it certainly doesn't make sense to me. The arguments didn't make sense to me. So no, I think of scrupulosity as being just a type of OCD. There are some people, though, who talk about a slightly different version of scrupulosity. The language is not so familiar to me. I've seen it in more Catholic writings. So, for example, the book by Joseph Chiraki called The Doubting Disease, which is written for folks with scrupulosity, a little bit from a Catholic perspective, although he tries to be broad about it. Talks about a couple different kinds of scrupulosity, including like a developmental one that's more normal, not just at a certain age, but at a certain religious stage, and that a person might grow out of just religiously. That's not, I don't feel like I have enough familiarity with that really to talk about that. So maybe some people mean that when they say scrup. The kind of scrup that I'm talking about, and I think we're mostly talking about today on this panel, I think that is a type of OCD.
Great, thank you, Jed. I'm listening, and at the same time, I'm processing what Tawana said, and what are things that I can say to her that will, because and I think you already know this, Tawana. I don't mean to veer off. I think you already know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I mean, I think that you have the OCD journey, which you're working on and making major progress at. And I think it feels like, and you already know this, but it just feels like everything else that you experienced is traumatic and trauma. You talk about the PTSD aspect of yours, but is such significant trauma and healing, and it's it's so completely separate, that I don't know that you could even answer the faith question for yourself, just by healing the OCD aspect. I feel like you would need to heal both to really make a clear decision for yourself about whether you would want what you want in your life. And again, I'm probably not saying anything, but it hit me. I was like, oh, because it's just that pain that you're going through, having nothing to do with OCD, the pure shaming of your community has hurt you so deeply. How do you reconcile that and want to go back, completely having nothing to do with your OCD? I don't know, just things I was thinking about. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
That's why I do advocacy, because I don't want anybody else to go through what I go through. And I told my therapist today, actually, because I talked to him today is a good day. Every day is not a good day for me, but I try to stay positive. I meditate a lot, as you know, Ethan, because I talk about meditation a lot. I meditate a lot and I journal a lot, but I try to. Anger drives me, and I'm not going to even lie about that. And if I wasn't mad, I wouldn't do half the things that I do. But I really don't want anybody else to go through what I went through. So I have to be their voice, even though they don't have one. And that's my main thing. And I made a promise to myself, and actually to my therapist. I told him if he was able to fix me, then I would do everything that I can do to spread this message, to get other people the treatment that they need so they don't have to go through what I went through. And that's pretty much what it is. It's I guess you could call it a little selfish, because I just don't want anybody to go through what I went through.
I relate to that. I think so many advocates do in their own way. But I want to just point out that he's a guide, but you're fixing yourself. He or she may be guiding the way, but it's you that's making the changes.
You think so? That's really a good day.
I know. So I think Jed would agree with me, right?
Totally.
On a bad day, I buy books, as you can see.
So I'm actually going to throw this out. Maya asks a great question. Hey, Maya, hope you're doing well. Hope you're still with us. If you're not, we're answering your question. I'm actually going to get this from Tawana's perspective and Katie's perspective. Let's start with Katie. At 7:16 p.m., Maya says, you touched on this a little bit, Katie, but how can priests and other religious leaders be educated about scrupulosity OCD to help people with scrupulosity OCD? What are some things, you said you're working on it, what are some things you're putting into place that you're finding successful?
Yeah, so I've talked to some different religious communities, and the interesting and sometimes unfortunate thing is sometimes religious practitioners struggle to hear things from individuals who are not other religious practitioners or who are working in the faith, where sometimes it seems like there's a disconnect, again, between mental health practitioners and religious practitioners, and vice versa. Definitely sometimes mental health practitioners don't want to hear from religious practitioners, but I'm working with some different religious leaders from different communities to put together kind of some programming to explain different mental health concerns, including OCD and including scrupulosity, to be able to come from someone in that community or who is considered an authority in that community, who is also aware of other things in relation to mental health. So like Ethan knows this, I'm doing another master's in clinical mental health counseling right now for that piece, but I'm also working with someone in the Muslim community and the Hindu community right now who are doing similar stuff so that they can come from that religious lens, also a foot in something else so that they're heard. I think part of it is amazing advocates like everyone that's on here and like Tawana being willing to speak out even when religious practitioners don't necessarily always want to hear it. But I think it isn't out of hatred or out of harm. It's just sometimes people know what they don't know. And I think the more that we continue to have those conversations, and I also think we can encourage priests and religious practitioners almost not to help people with scrupulosity, but to know what they don't know to be able to recommend out to someone who can help. So I think that's part of it too, is helping them to find connections in their area so that they can refer out to someone who can help individuals as opposed to saying, let's pray this away.
Tawana or Judd?
My thing is they need to be open-minded because my father is not. They need to totally be open-minded to different things and not be closed-minded on their own beliefs or what they believe it should be. They need to be open-minded.
Yeah, I mean, there are always going to be people who are not open-minded, and it's unfortunate, and it's not unique to psychology or psychiatry. That's my brother-in-law just texted me a story today. He's a cardiologist of somebody who was taking a similar sort of approach just with cardiology, and I don't need this because there's God, that sort of approach, and so that's always going to be the case. I think that, you know, we all come in with our experiences, and Tawana had a really terrible one that very much has to do with this. At the same time that I recognize that there are people out there who are so not open to this, I've been impressed actually by some people, some very sort of to the right, if you will, clergy people who have in recent years either reached out or demonstrated a real interest in collaboration and in learning about some of these things. So I'm hopeful at the same time. My experience is that very often there's a little bit of a mistrust kind of thing with psychology and psychiatry. And frankly, as a psychologist, I gotta acknowledge the fact that that's not for no reason. Academic psychology does not like religion for the most part. And there's a long history going back to Freud of conceptualizing religion as being all sorts of pathological things. And so it's understandable that there's a little bit of a hesitation. And so what I found is that people are clergy, let's say, and very religious people can be a little more open to these sorts of things if it's coming from somebody where they share a language and a background and that sort of thing. So I do think, you know, it's likely that somebody like Ted Witzig, who you had last week, it's likely that somebody like Ted can really be helpful in the Protestant or evangelical worlds. And it's likely that somebody in my situation or people like me can be more helpful in Orthodox Jewish circles and that sort of thing. And there might be a need to just respect the fact that people are going to be a little more comfortable with people who share a background, share a language, and that's okay. And we can meet people in the middle, and we can demonstrate that we're not trying to make everybody violate all of their religious beliefs and principles. We're trying to help them not violate them. In fact, like, how can we design an exposure that will be effective for ERP without crossing over into something that's actually prohibited? If you approach a clergy person with that sort of attitude, you're saying, hey, help me find a way to do this that's still permissible, but will violate the OCD part. And then you're both, or all of you are sort of working toward the same goal. So anyway, it's not a quick solution, of course.
Thank you. So thank you, guys. Thank you, Maya. It's a great question. And to your point, Jed, you don't have to put this up. Frank Carolyn wrote, I had a prominent people in my church encouraging me to get professional help. I don't think I've ever experienced any stigma, so don't lose hope, guys. So very interesting. It's just, as you said, Katie, it's kind of all over the map, which is part of the part of the problem. Danielle wrote, Fran, her question is at 7:24 p.m., but I'll read the beginning of her question at 7:23, Danielle Carter. So Danielle wrote, when I didn't know I had OCD, I had to watch sermons all day, go into a closet, pray at least 3 times a day, and listen to gospel. I could not listen to secular music or television anymore. Then she wrote, I felt better when I did those things, but now that I know what it is, I still feel the need to do those things. Did I make my belief into a compulsive behavior? Great question. Tawana, do you have some thoughts? And then we can pass it to Jed.
Yeah.
I have lots as well.
Well, my grandmother used to go in the closet and pray for hours. So I know about the closet. I really do. And I know about watching it on YouTube or whatever. Joyce Myers was my favorite one that I used to have to watch constantly watch it. So I can totally relate to that. I mean, I didn't know. I guess I didn't know I was doing something wrong. I mean, looking back on it, I had to know, but I guess I didn't really know because I had little kids at the time, and I would lock myself in a closet and pray for hours and hours and hours. So I that's so hard. My heart goes out to her if she's still living with that, but I remember that. I remember it. I remember having prayers all over my wall in my room, and my husband was like, "What are you doing?" I have prayers just everywhere. And I used to have to get up and read them in order. That was horrible for me.
Yeah, thank you, Tawana. It's awful. And I'll probably tee off Jed here, but Danielle, I don't know your history or your story beyond what you've said, but you wrote, I felt better when I did those things, which makes sense because we know compulsions do alleviate anxiety. That's why we continue to do them over and over again. Unfortunately, that reinforces the thoughts in the OCD, and then it works less and less, and that begins the cycle. And what I'll say is, but if you're still having the need to do those things, my first question is are you actually acting out on that need, or is it just simply a feeling? And B, have you had exposure response prevention or any gold standard modalities of treatment? Because then in turn you would eventually learn that you're going to feel those things. You're going to feel the need to compulse, but then not resisting. But you were shaking your head, Tawana. You're like, you already know she probably hasn't. If that was her experience, she's probably in a religious situation. Is that what you were thinking?
Well, she just put up that she posts sticky notes on the walls with prayers on the wall. Sticky note. I've been there.
Oh,
I mean, all my kids' names was on the wall because that was my prayer wall. It was huge. I've been there, and that oh my God. Yeah, ERP helped me a lot. ERP really, really helped me. And I don't mean to promote any type of drug, but Zoloft helped me in the beginning too, because I'm coming off of Zoloft. But Zoloft was a godsend for me to get over that. That was horrible for me.
Yeah. And we know, Jed can speak. Go ahead, Jed. Do you have thoughts? I keep saying Jed can speak to it, but here's my opinion.
No, I'm interested in hearing your opinion. The other I noticed what you pointed out, Ethan, in terms of the compulsion and feeling better. The other thing that jumped out to me in that question was the word belief. And as a therapist who does ERP, I don't have access to like cosmic truths about these sorts of things. I don't know the truth about how bad certain thoughts are and if thoughts can be sinful. A Christian would say yes, a Jew might be hedge a little more. Who knows? So
you didn't get that app? You didn't get that app? It's in the App Store. Okay.
No, I did not. And so for me, one thing that I find really helpful with a lot of folks with Scroop is to help them clarify what their beliefs are. Like what do you actually believe? And figuring out what they believe versus what they more emotional reasoning. Like I feel bad about it, therefore it's wrong to do, which is of course not really a rational thing. And more broadly to help people articulate their own criteria for making moral judgments. Like whenever I go to synagogue or church, I have this blasphemous thought come into my mind. And so this means it's like the unpardonable sin and I'm going to be doomed forever. And it's like, well, what are your criteria for when a thought would be like that? And do you apply that for other people too? Have you spoken to your clergy member about that? And what did they say? And if you found out that they said that they sometimes have intrusive, sinful thoughts and they handle them in the following ways, do you think that means that they're, fated for something awful? And if not, then what makes you so special? Really, honestly, I'm not trying to be, rhetorical. I don't know the answers to those questions, but can you work out, we all choose our beliefs to some extent. We don't know for sure. I guess that's where the word faith even comes in. What do you believe makes something sinful, or what do you believe makes somebody evil or bad? And thinking those kinds of things through forces you, if you have those obsessions, to try to both be rational and critical about your own thinking, and to take a stance and apply it fairly and evenly in a way that doesn't happen if you just are being reactive emotionally. You know, like when you're hot, when you're triggered, you're not gonna reason it through in a reasonable way. Okay.
Katie, thoughts?
Jed, you're speaking to, gosh, so much of what you said resonates with me. And I think it's really interesting, even from a clergy perspective, when I'm struggling with my own obsessions with OCD and sometimes religious scrupulosity. It's easy for me to say that hasn't been a big part of it for me, but I think it informs, as Jed said, kind of this umbrella with some of my larger obsessions where I feel like a horrible person and what would God think of this? And so I think what I've realized is there's a disconnect between what I actually believe about God and what my OCD says God is thinking about me. And I've actually worked with my therapist to write out, okay, as a clergy person, what is my theology? What do I believe? And I'm someone who doesn't believe in eternal damnation. I believe in a loving God. I believe in all of these things. And yet, for me, I've had some pretty scary obsessions. I've had some points, even as clergy, where with my harm and false memory OCD, I've blamed myself for losses of funerals that I've done. I've been to hell and back, like blaming myself for people's deaths, all sorts of different things. And I was at one point where I said, you know, this could be my fault. God must hate me. I deserve to die. I deserve to go to hell. And my therapist looked at me and she said, you march against the death penalty. You don't believe in hell. You don't believe in any of these things. And I don't, but my OCD still says that they're true. And it's really interesting. Like Jed said, I can look at this blanket statement that I have over the whole rest of the world where I say, oh, everything is forgivable. People are awesome. People are good. God loves everybody. But with me, I look at myself and think, oh, I could have done all these horrible things. I'm an absolutely horrible person. God is frowning on me. So I think it's really interesting to think about, what do we believe and what does our OCD tell us that we have to believe about God?
And Katie, it's one indication that it's worth thinking harder for anybody watching about those kinds of questions is if you're holding double standards. And it's not just with Scroop, it's with other kinds of OCD as well. If you hold yourself or respond to your thoughts, et cetera, in a different way from how you would to other people or about other people, maybe spend a little time figuring out what you really actually believe. And maybe you can articulate why you're special, and maybe in any given case you are, but that might be a good indication that there's something that's really the voice of OCD involved there.
I definitely struggle with that. I do. My inner critic / inner OCD, which I've said before, my OCD voice is Bernie Sanders. It sounds like Bernie Sanders. I don't have a problem with Bernie Sanders. But it's that OCD is that apparent to me because I sound like me inside, maybe a little sexier, but oh no, that's very clear when it's OCD voice. But that inner critic salesperson OCD, he's amazing. He could sell me anything, and every time I prove him wrong, every day he sells it to me again the next day, like I had no clue he was going to do it. So it's an incredibly powerful force or voice. I quickly want to go back. You don't need to put this up. I just want to read Manara's comment. It's so nice to be among people in similar situations. My father believed my behavior directly affected his ability to go to heaven. So he was very hard on me, probably intensified the scrupulosity symptoms. So I'm sure you can relate. At 7:27, I'm going to divide this between Katie and Jed, although I'm sure Jed might know. You know what, Jed? I'm sure Jed. No, I'm kidding. I love talking about Jed and then keep talking. It's my new thing. At 7:27 p.m., Love Lana asks, how common is mortification of flesh happening with religious scrupulosity? Does it still occur in this day and age? I was going to ask what mortification of flesh was and then ask you, does it happen?
I hope you're not asking me because I don't know what mortification of flesh is.
That's what I was going to throw that to Katie.
Katie, yeah.
hopefully.
Apparently, I'm a horrible clergy person. I don't know what that means either. I'm sorry.
Okay. Love Lana. You've stumped the panel. You win a free T-shirt from the IOCDF. No, I'm kidding.
I'm looking some stuff up.
All right, Google.
Oh, okay. Okay. Mortification of the flesh is an act by which an individual or group seeks to mortify or put to death their sinful nature as a part of being sanctified.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So that looks. So I'm thinking that you might mean completing something in order to ask for forgiveness of sins, completing particular rituals. Which I know we see in some communities who do conversion therapy with LGBT members, lots of different things like that. That might be what she's referencing.
I'm wondering if it's possible also that she's referring to like extreme asceticism or state kind of stuff, self-flagellation, some of the practices that, years ago, there were a lot of people in a lot of different religions who took the, fasting for days on end, those sorts of things. For spiritual or religious reasons, but nowadays, at least in America, would seem pretty extreme.
Absolutely. Thank you. Fran just said the wiki does list self-flagellation. So, yeah. So it might be flogging. Oh, I think Fran. Yeah. Anyway. I go on rambling sprees. It's fine. I'm on medication too, Tawana. So that's, part
I'm coming off actually.
Oh, I'm not. I'm going up on everything. So,
Girl, you don't have any symptoms. My symptoms came back with a vengeance. So I'm like working through it with the ERP. So I see my therapist twice every week. Just
awesome.
to help me through it.
And just to touch, because Tawana did mention Zoloft, for those of you that are new or have been on, we generally don't talk about medication. There's not a psychiatrist on the panel, but I will say that, what we can say effectively is that everybody pretty much agrees that some of the most effective treatment is the combination of medication and therapy. It doesn't, like in Tawana's case, it doesn't mean that you have to be on medication the rest of your life. But if you're at a place where you have a lot of trouble absorbing your therapy or the ERP or just surrendering a little bit, a bit of medication can really help with you open that little bit of window so therapy can get in there and sort of mess with the OCD so you can then take over. So just a little bit on that.
Something to that, Ethan.
What's that?
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
What you just said? Okay, as for me, it's my choice. My therapist would tell you he think I should be a lifelong person that's on medication. But because all these years ago when I was misdiagnosed and was put on all that medication I just don't want to be on any.
That's fair.
I just don't. So this is a choice of myself that you could say I took myself off under his care, but he is totally against it. Trust me.
Which is okay.
Can I say one thing to that too? Yeah, and that's totally a choice. I will say, just in terms of stigma, I've been on medication for quite a while now. I just went up on medication because it's a tough year. I am teaching 80 hybrid teenagers in religious studies in the middle of a pandemic. There's a lot going on personally. And that's what I always think of it. We always hear the quote around OCD that in the space between stimulus and response, there's a choice. And I always think of, ERP, of course, is the frontline treatment. But for me, I always feel like it just gives the space between that stimulus and response. It makes it a little bit bigger so that I have the opportunity to make that choice. So I always think of it as a nice little crutch that just helps your ERP.
Yeah. And there's no hard and fast rule to the process. Everybody's journey is completely different. That's why some medications work great. Others don't work at all. That's why some modalities of treatment work great. Others struggle with it. Everybody's journeys are completely unique, and we all have to do what's right for us in the moment. So
absolutely.
And trust your therapist. Trust your therapist. It has to be trust.
Yeah, we make therapy hard. We just really need to shut up and listen and say yes, which is really hard to do at times. But we like to overcomplicate by asking Jed 10 million questions.
No, I want to make myself obsolete. You don't want to have to keep asking me. You want to make these decisions and own them and own the responsibility for them, which of course is so hard for many people with OCD, and figure out like which are the beliefs you have and the risks you're willing to take. And so I know obviously that was you were mostly joking there, but just listening to the therapist is probably not even a great idea. Push back.
I do. We fight a lot.
So Danielle wrote, agree, Tawana, in our churches, this was a while back, but in our churches, we are called to study, reflect, and meditate on scripture each day, but how much is too much? Emily.
Meditating, because I was confused by that a lot. Meditating on scriptures is not the same as meditation, because it's totally different. I was confused by that for a while, because I was also told meditate on scripture. But if you're like obsessed with scriptures, that's not going to help. You have to actually do the deep breath, the deep breathing type thing. So I think that's a lot of confusion with that whole meditation on scripture type thing. I find confusion with it.
Yeah, definitely. It's two completely different types of things. So that makes sense. I just reiterated what you said, but I didn't need to do that. I'm going to move on now. Emily wrote at 7:30 p.m. You don't need to put this up, Fran. I still get hung up on praying my scrupulosity away. It's a compulsion of mine that I don't know how to stop doing. Jed, tell her how to stop doing it.
So prayer is super tricky because if there's those sorts of prayers where you're almost doing it as a compulsion, and then there are prayers that get more involved with like superstitious or thought action fusion kinds of things and beliefs. And so I actually I think it's unwise when therapists push folks who believe in, I don't know exactly what language to use, the efficacy of prayer, the power of prayer, whatever that means for them, to push them to treat it sort of like other magical thoughts. So in ERP, you might, if somebody's worried about accidentally causing with their bad thoughts, car crashes, you might go out on the sidewalk and look at cars and say, I hope you get into a car crash and that sort of stuff. And there's an understanding that, you're not really actually changing the chances of it. And it's a good exposure and you'll learn a thought is just a thought and a word is just a word. But I don't think that's super useful for prayer. I think that's a situation where if that's the approach you take, you end up having that conflict that we talked about before of choosing your faith versus choosing your mental health, and that's not necessary. So one way that I go about that, I really learned this from Jonathan Huppert when I was back in grad school, is to pray not for bad things per se. So we're not going to pray that my kid gets a terrible disease. We're also not going to pray in a compulsive way that either the OCD is resolved or that God should protect my kid from getting that disease. We're going to sort of pray almost for the uncertainty of it and trust in God. So that might look like, in one example, it might look like saying, look, obviously I really hope that my kid doesn't get sick. But God, if you in your infinite wisdom see fit or think it's best that this should happen, then I pray for you to do whatever you see best, even if it means my kid gets cancer, let's say. And then you don't have to battle with the beliefs. You're not trying to undermine prayer as a thing. You're also not using it compulsively. You're praying to God that God does the best thing and are willing to accept, almost as an act of faith, you might say, as part of the ERP, whatever God deems best. That sort of approach. So you definitely do not want to harness prayer for your compulsions, just like you don't want to harness anything else for your compulsion. You don't want to hand wash too much, even though there's a place for hand washing, and you don't want to use prayer too much, even though there's a place for prayer, confession, anything like that. Motivated by the right thing and the right dose at the right time, there's a place for all of that. You don't want to use it compulsively, but I don't think you need to undermine it totally on the other side either.
And I think there's a very palpable parallel happening right now, just even between what we're talking about in COVID, right? Where suddenly all of these big bodies like the CDC, especially in the beginning, were saying you have to wash your hands for 20 seconds. And so suddenly it's like, well, there is a great authority that is telling you to do something. And yet I'm getting, well, maybe I should do it for a little longer. Maybe I should do it for a little less. Maybe I should do it. And it's getting wrapped up. And it's very synonymous to religion, where you're looking also at a body of text or authority figures that are saying, no, you need to study, you need to worship, you need to meditate scripture. And then again, where do you tweeze that out? And I mean, what we've talked about in so many COVID town halls is that regardless, OCD is never going to be happy. You could do it the right amount of times, the less amount of time. OCD is never going to be satisfied. So I quickly want to jump on, this is more of a conversation piece, but I think it's a great sort of opposite. Aniko wrote, has anyone had the experience that they got help from religious leaders that they didn't get from clinicians? That happens too. I've experienced religious leaders far more open to incorporating, actually embracing wholeheartedly clinical help. I haven't found that in clinicians. Katie, do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think something actually personal comes to mind for me with that. Again, I think this can go a lot of different ways. There's the experiences that Tawana's had. I've had very negative experiences as well, but also very positive experiences. I think when I was pursuing ordination initially in college, my OCD got really bad. I was at a checking point where I was spending 8 hours a day checking ovens, stoves, locks, couldn't sleep. And wanted to seek treatment for OCD, but I was getting ready to go to grad school. I was getting ready to start pursuing ordination in a particular denomination. And I was told by my mentor, you can't get therapy. You can't get help because it'll mess up your ordination. They won't ordain you if they find out that you have a mental illness. So I really didn't get effective treatment for another 5 years after that until I got really, really sick. And so the interesting thing is when I eventually got treatment, it was also because of a religious leader. And I ended up in a denomination that I'm ordained in now. That's awesome. And at this particular church, the pastor actually was certified to teach mental health first aid. And I ended up in seminary taking a mental health first aid class from her. And she talked about OCD, and it was the first time I didn't feel shamed about having OCD, and actually went and got ERP for the first time, and started getting better, and had ups and downs beyond that. But I remember sitting there actually with this religious leader and hearing her talk about it and saying, "Oh my gosh, I actually need to get help." So I think there are both sides. There are both sides of that coin. I can't speak as much to the clinical, and I know most of the therapists that I've worked with have been pretty open.
Well, thank you, Anika, for bringing up the opposite, and thank you, Katie, for opening up as a professional, but really incorporating your personal experiences to really hit home some of your points. So thank you for sharing some really personal details. Really appreciate it. Fabrice at 7:34 p.m. We'll put it up for a sec, but we'll cover Katie and Tawana. My OCD personally is the fear that almost everything is a sin, especially things that I desire to do or care about. So I oftentimes avoid those situations or acts. I'm a Christian and wanted to just ask, how much do y'all think our OCD is spiritual versus physical? I constantly doubt if I'm hearing these thoughts from God, myself, or the devil. There's always the what if God is talking thought. Jed, do you want to speak to that a little bit first?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I don't know if I can address all of that, but I will say that one default that I sort of fall back on is that there's a ton of what ifs, and there's a lot of what ifs with religion, even having nothing to do with Scroop. There's a lot of what ifs with OCD, all kinds of OCD. And so as everybody here, I'm sure knows, chasing the certainty just gets you nowhere. That just spins the wheels of the OCD. So when there are what ifs pitted against a certainty, I find it useful to assume the certainty is right until there's good evidence otherwise. And what do I mean in this particular case? Maybe this is God. Maybe this is a message to me. Maybe this is telling me that I should do. Those are a lot of maybes. The one thing that we know for sure, though, is you have OCD. Mm-hmm. And so if you definitely have OCD and you definitely obsess about these sorts of things, and you definitely struggle with those kinds of uncertainties, I'm going to make the standard or the threshold to worry about alternatives more specific or more concrete. And until then, we're going to assume it's a risk, it's an exposure, but we're going to assume we're going to treat it like it's OCD. And we're going to risk that maybe this was God, your one chance in life to get this message from God, and you're going to miss it now. And that would be awful. But we know for sure that you have OCD, and we don't know any of this for sure. Now, I actually find it useful with folks who have scrupulosity to work a little bit on trying to identify what level question is a real question. So when I work with Orthodox Jewish patients, this comes up a lot because there's a lot of stuff that you'd call the rabbi to ask. You'd call to find out, you can't cross-contaminate dairy and meat in the kitchen, but this sort of touched that, but they weren't really hot, and this pot was over here, like things that you wouldn't know. And so working with people to identify like what kind of question is really a question and what is a reassurance seeking sort of thing where you know the answer. You could bet your life savings on this and you'd be pretty confident, but you're not 100% sure. Versus questions where people are like, I actually don't know the answer to that, so I need to ask. So that's a similar sort of process. And so the one piece that I can then address is that if it's just a what if, maybe this is an internal voice that's really God's message, but you have an internal voice that's intrusive in the form of obsessions, I'm probably going to ask you to take that risk and assume until proven otherwise that this is an obsession, and hope that you're right and tolerate the possibility that you might not be.
Well said. Tuan or Katie, anything to add?
As far as the voice, because I go through that to this day. What I do is I write it down. I write it down and then I read it out loud. And if it doesn't sound kosher, I don't put it in perspective like God, the devil, or mental illness. I usually just say, is it me or my mental illness? And if it doesn't sound kosher or realistic or something that I know I would do, then it's my mental illness. But that came with a lot of work. I just didn't get up one morning and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. Because I actually believe the devil and God, and I study spiritual warfare. Oh my God. And I studied all kinds of things to try to get that voice. And then I told people I was hearing a voice and they thought I was schizophrenic. So, I mean, now with the therapy and of the ERP, I know. So I write it down and I say it out loud. I have to say it out loud to actually hear it. To see what it is. Is it the mental illness or is it myself?
One thing that was really beneficial for me, and I've said this before in other town halls, in treatment, and when I was specifically really struggling, and then specifically in treatment, I was taught by a very forceful therapist who didn't let me make too many of my own decisions. She was tough. But she taught me early on, especially when I was struggling in the midst of it, that if it smells like OCD, if it seems like OCD, if it looks like OCD, it's OCD. So if I suddenly don't even try to figure it out at this point, all I want you to do is, if you're wondering if it's OCD or you, just assume it's OCD. Even if a little bit of thought comes up, that's like, I wonder if this is OCD. Yes, it is. Move on. Do your values. And it took a lot of the, I was going to say marinating, but it took all the reflecting out of trying to tease out what was OCD, or in this case, what was the God or devil or whatever. It took all that work out. We just switched places. That was crazy. No, I don't think you did it. But it takes a lot of that guesswork out and really allows you to focus on value-driven actions and the exposures themselves.
Can I give one super quick anecdote? Actually, I don't mean to get too specific into one religion, but it ties back into what we were talking about involving clergy before. Mm-hmm. The religious Jewish rabbinic literature has lots of examples where people emphasize that you take messages from what happens in the world to better yourself. And if something happens, you think, at least you imagine, this is all orchestrated to send me a message. And what can that be? And of course, for most people, they can just hear that as aspirational and it's nice. And people with OCD can get really stuck, though, with that sort of thing in a literal sense. I was working with a guy who had scrupulosity, and he was really afraid of committing a certain sin in Judaism. And he opened a Jewish religious text one day, right to the spot where it discusses that sin. And so he came into session really freaking out that this was a sign and really it's bad and all of that. I ended up having a conversation with one of the most ultra-Orthodox rabbis in my region about actually somebody else. And I just raised it to him. I said, what would you say from your perspective about this? And he cut me off mid-question. And he said, oh, he has OCD. He's not allowed to think that way. We know he has OCD, and that's the assumption. He's not allowed to read into anything because he's not going to do it in a reliable way or in a way that will be useful. So that's a great way where somebody had the insight and understanding about OCD to be able to really sort of change those rules. The message for most people is take it to heart, try to, improve yourself on the basis of it. But for somebody with OCD, ignore it, because you're going to take everything to heart and think everything is a message to you in a bad way, potentially.
My therapist tells me all the time, he says that a lot of people can trust their gut. You can't.
Exactly.
So he always tells me that. He was like, you cannot trust your gut.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, sorry, go ahead, Ethan.
No, go ahead, Katie.
Okay. So I think the key in that original comment was the what if, and of course, then the interesting thing is, I don't know, for me, it's always the, what if I'm a murderer? What if I'm a pedophile? What if I did something horrible? And we hear that and we're like, oh, I'm pretty sure this one's OCD. The what if is right there. But I think the issue is, at least for me, it always comes back and says, but what if this is the one that isn't? And that's where we tend to get stuck, right? What if this is the one thing that's important to me? What if this is the one time? And I think that's actually where we come back with so many people who struggle with scrupulosity to the radical faith, and also having faith in your treatment and having faith in your diagnosis and having faith in this process. Because as soon as you go down that what if rabbit hole, the insight will start to go downhill and it'll get even harder and harder to differentiate. So as soon as that what if comes up, having the faith that, all right, it's super scary, this feels like the end of the world, but I'm going to treat this like OCD. And like Ethan said, if it looks like OCD and smells like OCD, live into that.
Yeah, my therapist, one of my therapists early on, said, hand over the keys. You've been driving. You need to hand over the keys to me and let me drive and let me show you sort of the proper way to drive again. And then I'm going to give you the keys back at a certain point. And until then, and that's the gut. That's, don't listen to your gut. I'm going to drive, that sort of thing. I remember because at the time I was afraid I was going to accidentally hurt myself, and I was afraid I had a brain bleed and a concussion. I was going to get CAT scans. So at the time I wasn't allowed to go see a doctor. So regardless of, and during that 1.5 year period that I was in intense treatment, I never went to see a doctor regardless of what happened, because they were like, nope, you can't go to see a doctor. So I remember moving back to out to LA, and about 8 or 9 months later, I got the flu. And I'd been about 4 days, and I had 103 fever, and I was feeling awful. And there was no question in my mind I needed to go to the doctor. There was no doubt. I was like, I know what this is, but I didn't know that I could go to the doctor. I didn't know that she'd given the keys back to me, even though. So I called my therapist, and she wasn't even my therapist anymore. I'm like, listen, I've had a fever for 4 days, and is it okay if I go to the doctor? And she's like, yeah, of course you can go to the doctor. Why wouldn't you go to the doctor? I'm like, because you said I could never go to the doctor. Like, not forever, Ethan, just for while you're. So the point is, like, it doesn't have to be the extreme of I'm going to assume it's OCD all the time for the rest of your life, right? It's a process. You work through that process. And then as you start to get, as Katie said, objectivity and insight, as that stuff starts to come back and you move into maintenance, you can incorporate some of the things that you weren't doing back into your life. I love that Emily Smith, which apparently is my sister, said this. I'm kidding, I don't have a sister. But she says, I say this all the time. I'm a Christian and my family is as well. If a brain can get sick with dementia, why can't mine with OCD? A Christian would never say that dementia is some sort of lack of faith, but some Christians will say mental illness is. I don't understand. So that is completely accurate. I know there's a bunch of questions we didn't get to. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. You guys did awesome on advocacy in the comments. There's some great comments and support and some great conversation threads in here. So if you're on the chat and you want to go through and look, I would encourage you, as always. Everybody's advocating for themselves so well. Caroline, I'm not ignoring you. I see all your questions. You can definitely, and I see that you're a fan of Jed, as we all are. He's got some amazing insight. So as I always like to say, well, before we get there, I'll give out an email, Danielle, where you can send us some questions, and we'd be happy to answer them for you. If we didn't, and that goes for the same for anybody here that we didn't get their question answered. But final thoughts. We'll go around the block. So Katie, we'll start with you. Final thoughts on what it could be, anything really.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just. I'm someone who is clergy. I work with a lot of different religious traditions. I'm ordained, and just being able to say, I battle OCD. I have since I was 8. Sometimes things are really tough. I relapsed 2 years ago, and I just want to say, from a religious perspective, that that it's okay, and that there's no shame around that. And I'm so sorry for what so many in this space have heard from religious practitioners around shame, around treatment, around what that means about you or about it being a sin. And I just want you to hear from me that it's not, and that y'all are amazing people, and that you deserve to get help. You deserve to live a life full of joy and passion. And if faith is important to you, you deserve to have that as a part of your life in the way that it's meaningful to you.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Katie. Tawana?
My final words would be for everybody to speak their truth and to live their truth. And don't let anybody make you feel ashamed of your truth or that you can't speak your truth. Your truth is who you are ultimately, and all your experiences make up that truth. So speak them.
Thank you, Tawana. She walks the walk. She's still dealing with it, and she's here. So thank you for being here, Tawana. I appreciate it. And I know you're helping so many, as you are, Katie, as well. Jed, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to the theme from before, and Katie was really just at least partially saying it now, which is that you can get effective ERP that does not require you to give up what's important to you in any area of your life, including religiously. Now, it's fine if you don't want to have any part in religion too. That's a different decision. But if religion, religious observance, faith, whatever form that takes for you, matters to you and is part of who you are or who you want to be, even if you encounter therapists who try to push you to violate the religion and say that's your only way out, and even if you encounter clergy who try to say that you can't go to those therapists because they're going to do things that are the work of the devil or whatever variation you hear, I'm really sorry for that experience. It's very painful. It must seem really hopeless. You must feel very helpless thinking that two things that are so dear to you and matter so much are in conflict to the extent that you have to pick one, but it's not true. A good ERP therapist should be able to help you work toward your values and your goals, including religion, even if you have scrupulosity about religion, to get rid of the OCD part without violating the basic requirements and really working toward having a more meaningful religious or spiritual experience. You can have both. You should be able to have both. And you should be able to, I hope, access a therapist who can help you do good ERP that works and helps you with whatever is meaningful in your life religiously.
Well said. Thank you, Jed. As always, I want to thank my guests again, Jed, Reverend Katie, and Tawana, or Chaplain Kay and Katie and Tawana, for joining us tonight and spending your evening. Thank you for being here and having such a good conversation and asking some great questions. As always, I want to thank the International OCD Foundation, of course, my partner behind the scenes, Fran, for working his digital voodoo. If you haven't already and you want to be notified about all the program the IOCDF is having over the next month, definitely be sure to subscribe. Whew, words are getting tougher today. And follow on YouTube and Facebook. You can also now join us on Twitch as well. Hey, new Twitch. Anyway, so we're broadening our horizons here. And finally, if you have any questions, if we didn't get to your questions, please don't hesitate to email the IOCDF at info@iocdf.org. Obviously, you can reach out to the IOCDF for anything that you're dealing with or want to talk about. You can also, if you have questions for Jed, Katie, or Tawana, please feel free to email the IOCDF at that email address, and they will make sure they're forwarded to Jed, Katie, and Tawana so we can answer your questions. So, as always, have a wonderful evening. Stay safe, stay vigilant, feel the feels, don't let OCD off the hook. And thank you so much for being here tonight. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.